And we're live.
Hello, hello, welcome, welcome. It's 4 o'clock Pacific, 5 o'clock here in Costa Rica, 6 o'clock Central, 7 o'clock Eastern, midnight 11 o'clock in Dublin and in London, and midnight in Milan and most of Europe. 4:30 a.m. Wednesday morning in New Delhi, 9 a.m. in Brisbane. And I've finally got wise, everyone, and I'm looking at my phone as to the times. Midnight in Auckland and 8 p.m. in Rio de Janeiro, and it's Facebook Live. Wonderful to be with you. My family is here. Gio will come back in a moment to say hello again. And we have a really special guest who's not quite here yet, so it gives us a chance to hang out together. And Gio comes in to say hello. Yeah, Mary, you heard him. Here he is. He's got a cookie in his hand, and crumbs went down my shirt a minute ago. And say hi. Hi. Yes. Hi. Hi. There was a question that came in that I started to answer before we went live on all venues, and I want to continue with that question before our guest arrives. And that was from Kevin. I'm going to reread the question because it's such a profound question. Can you take him for a minute, please? And it said, I'm dealing with cancer and have been trying to heal more naturally before any of the more severe conventional treatment options that have been presented to me. I'm having issues with emotional constitution, confidence as I go forward, wondering if I'm doing the right thing and if I'm waiting too long before deciding to go from a natural to conventional protocol. In the meantime, I'm only physically present to my wife and children. So only physically present, not mentally and spiritually and emotionally present. I need help. And the first thing I said was congratulations to you for recognizing where you're at and taking ownership and responsibility and say, hey man, I need some help here. So kudos, that's a first step, big step. Most people live in denial and aren't quite dealing with that very well. I'm looking up the name of someone here on my phone to reference to you. And just one moment while I'm scrolling through here. And if it were me, Kevin, I would call Dr. Steven Eisenberg, who is an oncologist in San Diego, and he's a personal friend. And he's a big picture guy. And because I don't know the answer to when is it appropriate to get into conventional cancer therapy and when is it not. If I were in your shoes trying to do natural things first, I'd be looking for the markers that say that this cancer has stopped or it's going in remission. I'd want to see some biomarkers like temperature gauges on the dashboard of your car. You know, when I ordered my first car, 1984, my uncle was a senior guy on the assembly line at one of the assembly lines in Detroit. I'm from Detroit originally. And so he ordered a car for me, and I had the only Olds 1984 Oldsmobile Delta 88 that had a dashboard with a number of gauges on it that are not available in any other Oldsmobile, but he had them put on. And so I had oil pressure and temperature and of course fuel and battery charge and a couple of others. But I had temperature gauges, and I've always worked with patients with temperature gauges. We call them biomarkers, but they're temperature gauges, right? So I'd want to see some hard evidence that what I'm doing is working. And I don't know the type of cancer you have, but that would be my first step, is to talk to someone who would really know. And that's Dr. Steven Eisenberg in San Diego. And his website is Dr. Steven, S-T-E-V-E-N, drsteven.com, drsteven.com. And I'd schedule a consultation with him and say that you were on my Facebook Live and you're just not sure how long to go a natural approach and what would he recommend? And it's a starting point. He may not have the answer for you, but it's a starting point from someone in oncology who I've seen help foster miracles in a lot of people. Sometimes he uses chemo, sometimes not, sometimes radiation, sometimes not. I don't know all of his protocols, but I trust him. I trust him. Actually, when we had, in my family, we had that similar situation, I called Stephen first. I said, what do I do here, man? And he said, it's out of his league, out of his level of experience, but here's the guys to talk to. And so he was my first call. Perhaps that'll give you some guidance. And here we go. Our guest is here. I can see her photo, Dr. Lin Morel. So Anne will bring her on, and it'll be my pleasure to introduce you to my friend and an incredible person, Lin Morrell. Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Tom. How you doing today?
Oh, very good. Very good. I just had Gio here to say hello to everyone. And then a question came in before we got started. And so I wanted to answer that question. So let me begin. He's back. Come around this side.
No.
Yeah, he's back. He wants to come back again, Gio. He can't come through. He pushes all the lights out of the way. Get out of the way here. Come here.
Let me see this little guy.
Oh, he doesn't want to come on. He just wants to be in the area.
Hi, Marcy.
Okay.
Wherever you are, I hear you in the background.
Yes. He loves to take tripods and move them around, like my easel, my whiteboard, drags them everywhere, and he's doing that with the light now. Okay.
Oh, he's got good lung power. He's
Yeah.
so big. Theo, hi.
All right. Let me introduce my friend, Dr. Lin Morel. Dr. Lin Morel is a best-selling author, speaker. Gio sat on my glasses yesterday and they broke and this lens pops out. So until I get a new pair, this is what I get to work with. Dr. Lin Morel is a best-selling author, speaker, international consultant, and trauma specialist for body, mind, and spirit. She works with thought leaders, world changers, and those committed to sharing their brilliance and vision with the world. Some of her clients include W.R. Grace, Bell Telephone, and leaders in the aerospace and entertainment industries. She's a joyous author of several publications, including her newest book, The Grace of Love, which is now available on Amazon, and we're going to post the link here for her book. Dr. Lin's life has been shaped by multiple traumas. Her search for wisdom and freedom from the past led her on a heroine's journey and into the world of martial arts. A nationally ranked karate champion and 5th degree black belt. She also attained a black belt in Aikido and studied Tai Chi at the University of Beijing and in Taipei, Taiwan, which taught mastery of her energetic field. Today, she is a wisdom keeper whose expertise has helped thousands of people worldwide transform their past and current obstacles into opportunities to create a better than they can imagine life. So I've never read an introduction like that before. And that's because Dr. Lin Morel is quite unique out there in the world. And I'm proud to say that she is my consultant. And I work with Lynn every week, mostly every week, sometimes not, but quite regularly for almost 2 years now, about, I think, somewhere in that. And she's really quite special, and it's really a privilege to share her with you today, my Facebook world. So here we go. So Lynn, first, thank you for being here. It's really an honor. And I know the calling that takes you to distant lands to study something unusual and out of the norm. I did that when I was in my early 20s. I went and lived in a martial arts school in Japan, world headquarters for Aikido. And so I know that calling. What have you found about following that calling and how it's impacted on the rest of your life?
That's really a good question, Tom. It's almost as though my destiny was pulling me. As a chubby little 15-year-old kid who couldn't chew gum and walk a straight line, my younger sister and sister-in-law wanted to take judo lessons. I was a bookworm, but I became the designated chaperone when my sister-in-law quit. And it was like a duck to water. Within 3 months, I was teaching the men the new ones how to fall. When my judo teacher asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said I want to be a teacher. And I did run a karate school with my first husband for quite a few years, decades actually. And that ability to find mastery over my body took away the fear that I was surrounded with. And it allowed me to blossom under the tutelage of a very gentle vaudevillian who performed in front of the Queen. He was quite an interesting character, Gene Waddell was. And in the toughest times, he was a surrogate father figure that I would sit on his couch and cry while the Dobermans and standard poodles would lick me. And he'd hand me tissues when my mom was in the hospital. And that gentle ability to see myself with new eyes, because I thought I was fat, chubby, uncoordinated, and I just blossomed in this environment. And that's actually how I got started, dragged kicking and screaming to a class I didn't want to go to.
Interesting how our fate leads us where we don't think we want to go. Really interesting.
That's an understatement, isn't it, Tom?
So one of the platform concepts that I talk about in my books is that when investigating a health concern, any type of health concern, there are 4 categories that we have to look at. And I call it the pyramid of health. And sometimes people say, wait a minute, pyramid's only got 3 sides. No, it's got 4. It's got a base, and that's your structure. And then the 3 sides that we can see are the biochemistry. That's what we all focus on almost all the time for health, is what we eat, drink, the vitamins we take, the pharmaceuticals we take. That's the biochemistry. And then there's the emotional or spiritual, and then there's the electromagnetic. Mm-hmm. So it's structure, biochemistry, emotional, spiritual, electromagnetic. And any of those areas can be the primary trigger for whatever the health problem is that is driving a person to want to be better about something, better health, whatever. In the world of the mental or spiritual, can you just start giving us kind of a bigger picture view of what that world is? Because I don't think most of our people have a grasp of how stinking thinking can cause any health concern. So if we're looking at that world, that the topic of the glasses I'm looking at life through, how does that impact on us?
Oh, it changes everything, Tom. What we perceive, becomes our reality. And if we focus on the negative things that happen to us, we're going to tank. The body will get sick, the physiology will be off, we'll have aches and pains and get hurts, of all sorts of things, bad backs. I went through that as I was recovering from my own trauma. And I found that for me, I didn't set out to be with a spiritual perspective. I set out as a chubby kid going to classes, being a bookworm. And so my world was contained within books. Luckily for me, I read positive books. So Nancy Drew, Cherry Ames, the Hardy Boys. I wanted to be a detective when I grew up. And I wanted to be a forensic physician. And I wanted to solve problems. But that was really a metaphor for me wanting to unlock my own life. So in the beginning, I looked externally. My self-esteem came from the karate. I was one of the very few women back in the 60s to study martial arts. And I was there was one other woman in the class, and I'd have to sneak into the guy's dressing room and get out really fast. And they accepted me, however, because I had prowess. that surprised them. And out of that one little area where I could feel good about myself, that gradually expanded as my confidence expanded. And when you're sparring, or even randori and judo, which is a kind of sparring, if I would think a negative thought, I would lose. And so I, by the very nature of my desire to excel in a physical thing, which became my foundational safety zone, I was able to expand my horizons. And as that happened, I would have, for lack of a better word, a mystical experience. You know, there was a time that I got strangled, and we won't need to go into that, but I was out of my body, and I was able to observe myself as a little kid being shook. And that stayed with me, that I could see I was something other than that body. I didn't have the words as an 8-year-old to share what that was. But another event happened where, again, I was out of my body. And I thought I was crazy, by the way, with all this stuff.
Crazy because you were observing your own body?
Yeah. And this is in the 50s, in the 60s. So I didn't know what to do with that information. So I got curious about it. Like, this was something, and I did have a thing where I saw very bright light. And from the time I was maybe 17 until my 40s, I would squish my eyes together wanting to see this light, because it felt so yummy. It's the only word I could describe.
Mm.
And I went about my business, and, went to college, did super overachiever because of trauma and feeling inadequate. And in that context, my martial arts life kept growing, and I got more and more proficient, so that I was no longer doing things. I was allowing myself to flow with energy. And that flowing and that sense of an energetic connection, both with my martial arts, but with nature. I could not get enough of nature and trees and being out in solitude. And those were the things that began to knit me together. So I used my mental facility to do graduate school while I was still an undergraduate, and overachieved to compensate for what I couldn't yet articulate. And that was how my pyramid began to coalesce.
Yes.
I got curious about it, about why do I always pull the left hamstring, or, what is it that led me to self-destruct in a tournament? And so I became a witness to the parts that I had locked away. And I got very curious about what made me tick. And that was the beginning of this journey that led me to where I am today. I did, in fact, become a detective. I support people with traumas that can't remember them. We don't need to rehash them, but we do need to allow them to witness the part that split out as a part of their challenge. And I love what I do. I am connected to what I would call spiritual force. For me, it's Christ. It could be Buddha for anybody else. But that ability to step aside from my personality and to allow the love to flow through me and the words to come from me to touch other people's lives. And I don't know how I do it. I don't need to know how I do it. I just know that it works.
I do too. I know that what you do works. I've just been watching Betrayal recently. Again, is the series that Marzi and I put together a few years ago on autoimmunity, and it's available at theDr.com /betrayal. We'll put a link in here for everyone. So if you haven't seen it, it's free and it changes lives every day. And I had forgotten this story that I talked about during an interview on betrayal. That woman came into me in her late 20s or early 30s with rheumatoid arthritis. And many of the diseases often have some emotions along with them. And I know that many rheumatoids, I won't say every one, but many of them have unresolved anger. And as I sat and talked with her, And I was looking over the history. This was our first visit, and I have a very extensive history. I said, you know, it looks like your issues with the joints in your body began somewhere around the age of 14. And that, you know, you mentioned this and this and this, and then they got worse and worse and worse. And by your early 20s, you're diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis.
Mm-hmm.
She said, yes. I said, so what happened around between the ages of 9 and 12? Because joint problems don't come on out of the blue. You know, there's something way out of balance and it causes inflammation and eventual pain. But unless you take a fall or some trauma or something, it doesn't happen overnight. So I just took a guess and said, what happened a few years before that? No, nothing happened. No. I said, so no, take a moment and just go back. You know, what happened? And all of a sudden, this look of complete terror came over her face. And she started sobbing and almost screaming. And I just put my hand on her shoulder and just let her continue for a couple of minutes until she could talk. And she had completely buried that she had been sexually abused when she was 10 years old by her uncle. She'd completely buried it, completely forgotten about it.
Yep.
That was the trigger of the unexperienced emotions that got buried. You know, you hold it in. If you don't feel what's going on in your life, you hold it in. Where do you hold it? You got to hold it somewhere. And anger is often held in your joints, right? That's why I say rheumatoids often are angry people under the surface or something, not in there. They're very sweet, kind people in general, but under the surface or something. So this thing about unexperienced emotions, can you talk a little about that? Can you give people just some background on what you went through that led you to write the book that you've just written, and tell us about the book? So let's start with back there and roll into the book.
Absolutely. Well, first off, my experience with people with rheumatoid arthritis is exactly what you're describing. Just today, I worked with a client who had been numb for most of their life. And today we were able to address where they had buried the emotion that could not be handled. And I've seen it over and over. And from a neurological point of view, the left brain is very logical and it wants order. And it's really good at suppressing the emotions, which are messy, which is the right side of the brain. And in some ways, we separate out. And the way the anger is stored is in the joints, or the way, you know, the liver stores things. And I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, Epstein-Barr, Lyme, fibromyalgia, all of those things. But rather than being annoyed, I started doing right and left-hand writing. So they actually entered into a dialogue with the quote diagnosis.
Wait a minute, wait a minute. You said left-hand writing. What do you mean?
So I'm right-handed.
Yeah.
I would write with my left hand. So I'd write the question, can you tell me what's going on? And then with my left hand, my childish hand, I would print out the answer.
That's why I asked the question. Yeah.
Yep. And it dismembers some of your mind's logic when you put it in your left hand as a little kid learning how to write. So those were some of the keys that made me curious about these onslaught of things. That's my attack Labrador. And from the time I was a little kid, they always said I had mono, or I had this, or I had that, but I had repressed all those emotions from the time I was very, very little and taken from my mother, and pretty much the gamut of standard trauma that women go through, or young people sometimes. That put a shell around me, and the martial arts became my safety place. I never had to fear for my physical safety. My emotional stuff, on the other hand, was seriously repressed.
Yeah, buried. It was buried deep underneath all of the
deep. And, you know, I could be 150-pound bagged and the guys would stand around and go, whoa, I'm not going to mess with you. And I taught karate for many, many years. But the injury that I had, literally, I tore all the ligaments in my knee the year I would have been on the national team, and so that stopped me, and it gave me pause to go, whoa, what's going on here that this happened? And that was really the beginning of my journey through the emotions. I had anger, I had rage, I was really soft-spoken, I was a super overachiever. I married a man who became bipolar and very abusive after 14 years together. And I found that my traumas of the past were revisiting themselves. So I got also curious about the bloodline in my family, like what happened, say 3 or 4 generations back. And I found similar kinds of issues. So the issues in the tissue, I like to say, and that the genetics will come forward in a way to protect us from the very thing that we end up attracting. And so that allowed me to begin to heal myself. And I became involved with a spiritual organization. Since I had I call it a near life experience, not a near death experience, because close my eyes here, I wake up there, and wow, I like there a whole lot better. But it was like time to come back and share what I learned. So back in '84, when I came back from the University of Beijing, I started a consulting practice. And I didn't know I was starting a consulting practice, but my husband at the time invited a whole bunch of people over and said, Lynn's going to talk tonight. Now, mind you, I was the one that never talked at all, and now you can't shut me up. And so leading to the book, My Beloved Grace of Love, I married and divorced my first husband after 17 years together. I married a wonderful man named David, who died in a plane crash 3 years later. I waited 12 years and worked on my own self. I knew I could not attract a relationship that was loving unless I was loving myself, because everybody's a mirror. And that emotional state of suppression with nurturing on my part, I let it emerge without judging. And I would oftentimes sing at the top of my lungs, because I worked all up and down the East Coast, and I traveled all over doing workshops with people. And in my car, I would sing to the point where I'd be sobbing, and if need be, I'd pull over. But it allowed me to have solitude and release and say what needed to be said in an environment not of condemnation, but wow, where'd that stuff come from? And so I was able to vocalize without even remembering everything that happened for many, many years. And then when David died, those memories came to the surface with the grief, which was, it was the good news and the bad news. So I took several years off. I ran a retreat center. And at one point, I put an X for a year in advance that I was not fit to work with people again until at least a year. Worked on myself for a year. And a lawyer called me from Washington, D.C. soon after and said, I'd like an appointment. I said, I'm sorry, I don't have an appointment until next November. She goes, I'll take it. And so she came, and then I was actually in a place where I could be of service again. I needed to be of service here before I could be good for anybody else. And, the serendipities in life, Tom, I went to a woman's church meeting, the women's circle or something, just the first and only time. And they were discussing the Old Testament. And they said, if you could be any prophet, who would you be? And out of my mouth came, I'd be Solomon, because I want the wisdom. So my life has been about finding wisdom, evolving wisdom, that I can there, like what you did with that woman. I'll be really, really still, and their body will tell me. Mm-hmm. Like today, it was, what happened when you were 11? And the person said, I'm ashamed to say what happened when I was 11. It's terrible. I said, well, it may be terrible, but it's what's giving you your challenges. And if we can just be brave, you don't have to remember them. I have them count them out sometimes, because the unconscious knows what's going on. In the old days, therapists made people revisit their traumas. That traumatizes you even more.
Yes.
And so this way of non-trauma is an algorithm. And if they can count out the key word, like I forgive myself for behaving as if I caused my trauma, for example, and they count that out, that will trigger their unconscious, which I like to say is like the Vatican catacombs. The stuff is stuffed away. And by counting it, I'll say it may get heavy. You may have to go 44 A, B, C. And they're sobbing, but when they're done, the trauma has been addressed, brought to the surface in a way that's not going to re-injure the person. And that's the thing I treasure the most. And that's what led James and I to do our work together.
Let me stop there for a moment. The trauma has been released in a way that doesn't injure the person.
Right.
That's a critical concept, because what you're talking about for some people is airy-fairy. It's like, what? But when you can work with that emotional buried baggage, whatever it is, in a way that's non-traumatizing, and you can almost like observe it as opposed to be reliving it, and you can then begin to dissipate it, then the energy of what you've been holding in starts to let go.
It does. And health comes back.
That's right.
And vitality and the energy. When I see someone dragging around saying, I'm tired all the time. And when something's coming up, that's exactly what I'm like. I'm tired. But when it's released, that energy that's been suppressed by the left brain just goes whoosh, and health can come back. I mean, we don't have to suffer any more than we have. And yet I have found that were it not for my suffering and overcoming and saying, yes, I can do this. Oh my God, how am I going to do this? Yes, I don't know how to do it. I don't have to know how to do it. I just kept writing goals that I would be trauma-free of X, Y, and Z. I remember I probably worked with my mother for 40 years. My grandma then came up. She raised me till I was 5. And I'm in the shower one day saying, Lord, how much longer do I have to count out my grandma? And I heard, as long as it takes. Within 2 or 3 days, I was at total peace with my grandmother and with my mother and with my family of origin. And I adore them all. And they all did the best they could.
Maybe when you accepted the answer that came up, as long as it takes, lighten up, just stay in the process. Then
Exactly.
within a couple of days, it dissipates.
Exactly. And you know, there's a Teresa of Avila, a saint in the Catholic Church. I'm not Catholic, but I studied him for spiritual formation and direction. And so she used to say, girls, let's storm the gates of heaven, right? There's only one small thing. The gates of heaven open out. You can't storm anything, but you can be receptive to the healing, receptive to the possibility that's a very convoluted journey. But on the other side, there's a depth of compassion and grace and the reflection of the courage that it takes to walk that human journey. Oh my God, Tom, it's amazing.
It's extremely powerful work. You know, we've had the privilege of hosting a couple of events where people fly in from around the world and spend a day and a half with us. And I've done those in San Diego. And these are people who have done a lot of work on being healthy, and they've done the basics, every one of them, and they've had improvement, but they haven't quite nailed it yet. And so that was the motivation for them to come to San Diego to do these events with us. And it was so powerful that most every person had tears in their eyes as they were getting in the limos to go back to the airport on Sunday morning. They were just so grateful, and there were tears of gratitude. But consistently, the biggest culprit that was unknown was what was buried inside that they just couldn't see. And when they were in a safe space to look at the mental or emotional side of the pyramid of health and not be threatened that they have to relive the trauma, that their eyes opened up, and whatever the issue was all of a sudden it didn't have that same power of negative energy holding it in that had been the unresolved trigger. The emergency brake, you back out of a driveway and you say, well, what's wrong with this car? It's not moving very well. Oh, yeah, the emergency brake. And you let go of the emergency brake and then it goes just fine. That the emotional or mental side of the pyramid of health is the most common emergency brake when people are trying hard with everything else. They've got the right form of vitamin C and the omega-3 fish oils, and they've taken the heavy metal tests and they're getting the mercury out. When they've done all of that and they still have this resistance, that what we're talking about here is the most common and powerful trigger that opens up the floodway to better health again and again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And unlike you, I ran a retreat center for 8 years. I had, a total of 64 acres in the woods. And I would have both corporate executives come and people that were traumatized. And each person responded differently, but getting them in nature with their back to a tree. Or there were times when I had a clown that I hired who was also the cook. And these guys would drive up in their Porsches and their whatevers. And she'd come out with her plastic bag and say, take something out of it. And they'd pull it out and say, now wear it. And within like 5 minutes, these grown, serious adults are laughing and giggling, and that joy is so exquisite when you can feel safe enough to laugh. And we created a really safe container for people, that everybody was there for everybody else. And the joy that can be unleashed when you give yourself permission, like anything was acceptable. If they cried, it was fine. If they sulked, it was fine. If they wanted to sit out, it was fine. It was trauma of informed care before there was trauma-informed care. And that allowing them to get curious about this thing that's driving them. And I used artwork, I used, you name it, we did it. And like you had your people leaving, they would write, oh my God, I never thought this would be done. I never thought this could be handled. And some of the traumas, children being hung, rescued by the police just as they're about to die. The width and breadth and depth of the human ability to endure trauma. And sometimes it's simple as, your dad's a peeping Tom, and each person has their own journey. And that journey is what makes them what I call diamonds. When they do that work, it's unshakable what they can then accomplish. And it's loving is the key, Tom.
Yeah. We have some questions. Let's go to a couple of questions, and then I want to go to the book and the story of the book. So the first one comes from Shanquila. She says on Facebook, how long do you give a modality to work? I've done EMDR for 10 months and about 35 sessions, and I'm using flower essences. I feel better, but I'm not where expected. What do you recommend? Thank you.
Oh, what a great question, Shaquila, and thank you for asking it. Everybody's different. My statement for myself is if it works, work it. And if it doesn't, do something else. And you will know internally, and there's nothing wrong with EMDR, but each person heals differently. What I would recommend is something I call free form writing. And I have a free course on my website called Living Your Best Life. You literally light a candle, you write what you're thinking for 20 minutes. You don't reread it. There's no punctuation. Like mine goes like this. I've been doing it almost 27 years. I hate to freeform write, but I need to do it today. And I just do that, no punctuation. And then it's like, oh my God, it's not 20 minutes. So you set your timer for 20 minutes. When you're done, you burn it. And if you can't burn it, you shred it. What you're doing is putting a tiny borehole into your unconscious so that you can let this come out in the most gentle way. Like there were times when I would scribble furiously for 19 minutes and nothing would happen. And the last minute, I'm sobbing like a baby. There were times when I was pre-verbal and my pen would scratch because I didn't have a language to write. And I did that. Oh my gosh, there's one period I did it every day for 6 weeks. You don't need to do that. But if you did 1 or 2 or 3 days a week, and always if you said you were going to do it, you had to do it, because that's training your inner self that you follow through. And if you think you can only do it 1 day a week, do it 1 day a week. But it will allow you to release, like what do you call it? If you're making steaming beans or something, a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
You're just going to let enough out that your psyche will have breathing space. And I've used it for a very long time.
It's a very powerful exercise. I've not heard of that before, and that's very powerful. I can see right away that it would be. And Shanquilla, I'm going to add to that, I use biomarkers as much as I can. Test, don't guess. And so I'm looking to see what are the markers of an imbalance that I want to fix. And if it's in the emotional or spiritual area, how do you react to different situations may be the marker, you know, when you objectively look. And if you're reacting very similarly to when this energy comes in, I do this, then, you know, 35 sessions is great. You've given it a good shot. And you may want to include something else in your protocol. And Lynn's exercise is a great one. I would strongly recommend that. Let's see. Mashid on Instagram says, what is your opinion of SSRIs and SNRIs, antidepressants?
Well, I would defer that to you, Tom. I'm not a licensed physician. I find that for people that are in my family that have used antidepressants, it didn't get to the core issue.
Yeah, my answer to that is, if you've got high blood pressure, you take the medication. You better take the medication, but you don't stop there. You explore, why do I have high blood pressure? So if you've got depression and you can't function in life, you take the medication. If you need it, you take it, but you don't stop there. You explore, why do I have depression? It's not because the wires are set up wrong in your brain. You know, the anatomy is okay. So it's not that you were born deficient or with crossed wires. There's just ways that a person approaches life that were great survival tools when you were a child that are not necessary anymore. Exactly. And they're buried underneath all of this suppression. So you got to, like, boots on the ground, you know, you got to get in the mud and wrestle with this, whatever it is. And Lynn is a master at that. And as she said, she's got a course on her site, and she also works individually. You've got the link here for Lynn's website. So that's a really great question. Thank you for that one. Really
if good. I can just add one little thing. If you look at a continuum of our emotions, catatonia is your energy's completely stuck, up to, you know, frenetic, you know, running around in circles. Anger is a higher vibration than depression, you know, and so there's a continuum. And there are times and places where absolutely that's the thing to do. But if you can be curious, and rather than hate the depression or hate the this, get curious about it, because in a sense, it's a friend trying to show you something.
It helped you survive.
Exactly.
There's a reason why these developmental modalities, the way we approach our life, or the way that the energy coming at us we deal with, there's a reason for this. And at some point, it helped you survive. You don't need that anymore, but this is the reflex reaction. And as you get conscious of this stuff, and it takes some time to get conscious of it, then you've got choices, you've got other options. Working with someone like Lynn is just very powerful. And some days you're laughing your head off, some days you want to punch the wall. You know, it's all part of the process. Let's see, Cynthia on Facebook says, I'm considering biofield tuning, a skilled practitioner using tuning forks to help clear out energy fields. Thoughts?
Well, I've had biotuning done. I found it very pleasurable. I didn't have an opportunity to do it a long time, but a friend of mine was a biotuner. I found that the resonances were comforting. So I really can't speak from depth, but there's nothing wrong in looking and searching and trying things.
Right.
And the key, as Tom said, is to stay long enough so that you give it time to work. And I would say internally, we all know when it doesn't work. At some level, we know, and there's no shame in saying, I'm done doing this, I'm going to do that.
Right.
It's
Right.
not like being guru hopping, but it's like finding the path for you back to even better than you could imagine outcomes.
I started working with tuning in 1981. And my mentor, Dr. George Goodhart, who was the founder of applied kinesiology, the muscle testing that everybody does, he taught us about tuning and how it can be helpful to break up energy blockages. And that's a primary goal, is to either break up a blockage, like a dammed area, like a dam, water in the dam, it's a dammed area, or to increase energy flow through a deficient area. Kind of like hooking your jumper cables up from one car battery to another, to a dead battery, to bring some juice back into it. So the tuning can do that. I personally did not find it to be game changing. I found it to be helpful, a nice tool, but in my practice, I didn't find it game changing. But many people do, and it certainly is worth a shot. If you have that desire, it's worth a try. It's safe. As far as I know, it's completely safe.
And then I've used them, and I've used Tibetan bells and bowls. I mean, Native American chanting, it's the same kind of idea.
Right. Let's see. Mary on Zoom asks, what about PE, prolonged exposure for trauma? I don't know what that is. Do you know what PE is?
Prolonged exposure. Well, I would say in the old days, if you went to a therapist, they would make you hash it out and hash it out and hash it out. From my perspective, it was archaic. That's what the prevailing wisdom was. But as we move into the more neurological age of understanding the left brain's going to stuff the stuff. In a sense, it's like a separate thing, and so we package it up and we bury it and we put it in a corner and try to pretend it's not there. That's our left brain's job. That allows us to cope with the trauma. But there comes a place of diminishing returns that if we don't address, the tiger in the room, the quality of our life is going to diminish. So I call it the heroes or the heroine's journey. When we get curious about what made me depressed or what made me angry, and I became a witness to the aspects of myself that got locked up. And all of the things that we talked about may work for someone here. So don't give up if the first thing doesn't do it. But ultimately, we are the ones that heal ourselves through loving ourselves, through witnessing it. I mean, I spent decades hating myself. Overachiever, ridiculous.
The book that changed my life when I was going through a divorce in 2000 was a book called When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. And there was a word in there that she talked about, a Tibetan word, and I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but I call it Maitri, M-A-I-T-R-I. And it means loving kindness and an unconditional friendship with one's self.
Yes.
Unconditional. You are your own best friend. And that's the starting point. So this concept of prolonged exposure to trauma, reliving trauma, there's not much that I am vehemently against, but I'll go toe to toe with anyone that wants to argue the benefits of that one.
Right?
I
You and me
agree.
both.
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Morel just said, that it's archaic, and it comes from the days of Freud. And it's just, my first wife was a Jungian analyst and a social worker, and had a private practice. And, you know, so many people get damaged by going through that type of protocol, and it brings no joy. And
No, I mean, I had a therapist who decided to reenact one of my traumas. And that was so incredibly traumatic that I would never wish that on my worst enemy.
yeah, yeah. And then after the hour, okay, time's up, see you next week. And then you walk out completely traumatized,
Mhm.
unable to
Exactly.
function in life, you know, to some degree.
And,
So
and loving it all, Tom, just loving the parts that you hate unconditionally, as though it were a child having a temper tantrum, that does more to heal our psyche than anything else. Loving kindness.
yeah, exactly right. So Lynn, let's talk about your book. Please tell us a little more about your book, and the links here for everyone. And please go to
Okay.
Amazon and order this book. And but tell us a little more.
Okay, so husband number 3, his name was James Putney. I met him by almost running him over, you know, literally. He got out of his taxi, realized he left his wallet. He jumped in front of my van. Thank God I was going slowly in front of the hotel. And I had this sinking feeling that he would be at that workshop that I had put on for a speaker friend of mine. Sure enough, I walk in the room. There were 15 of my clients in the room. There were maybe only 30 people all told. And I was flitting around saying hello to everybody. And I sat in the second row, and the man that I'd almost hit was in front of me. And then, you know, Doug says, introduce yourself to the person in front of you and behind you. So I introduced myself. Hi, my name is Lynn Morrell. I'm the lady that almost ran you over. And thus began our relationship. And I think I ran him over for the duration of our marriage. He used to say that we were the Brownings of the 21st century. He was a consummate poet. He had had multiple traumas, 14 surgeries by the time he was 21, that involved breaking his bones, resetting them so that he could walk. And the loss in his life was his brother and his protector was killed by a drunk driver. He sacrificed himself and spun the car so that the driver hit him instead of his fiance. So that was part of James's trauma. And growing up different, and, you know, he's in a full body cast for a total of 3 years, take it off, put it on. And what I admire about him is when the Grateful Dead came to town in Maine, he called his close friend up and says, can you get your mom's station wagon? I want to go to the Grateful Dead concert in a full body cast. So the guys put him under their shoulders, and they carried him into the front row and propped him up. He stopped the show. And that was the nature of James. So we were neighbors. I gave him a ride home that night. And he was the chaplain at UCLA. He worked in the oncology department. He sat with people in times of crisis. I would also work with him. I did a lot of stuff at UCLA, but we were incredible poets. We did emails virtually every day of our marriage for 8 years. And so the book is a compilation of our love letters, our poetry. It's the nitty gritty of how we wrestled with our traumas, how we overcame the parts of us that were reticent to open up and be real. So it's a book that's real about our struggles, about our loving and our commitment that no matter what happened, if we had an argument, we would always be more loving afterwards. And that was the basis, transparency and loving. You know, I see how much I've grown. I think someone by the name of Tim Johnson asked if I would write a book and be on the TV show, but I couldn't do it, but I did print out all of our emails. And so that's the basis of this book. And some of the poetry It's exquisite. You know, he called it a born again marriage. It's very short. And he asked me to marry him every day of his life when he got up in the morning. It's called a born again marriage. I marry you at sunrise. I marry you at noon. I marry you at sunset. It's never a moment too soon. I marry you with each breath. I marry you in the moment. I marry you with all my heart. It's a marriage beyond life and death. Marry me again. Celebrate our marriage that will never end. That's one of his first poems. And
Can you imagine just opening a book and reading that, and then just closing the book and taking a deep breath and just appreciating the degree, the depth of love and communication? Wow, that's really quite remarkable.
thank you, Tom. I cried my way through most of the book, not tears of sorrow, but tears of how much loving two traumatized people could bring into a marriage that had we not done the work. I spent over 12 years between husbands after David died working on myself, because I knew that who I became would be what I would attract. You know, and when we point the finger at others, as my Indian grandma used to say, Twyla, these three point back to you. So you better watch who you're pointing at.
Right, you're outnumbered. You do this and you're outnumbered, man. It's coming right at you. Three of them are right there.
and this is really a wonderful primer for how to have a good relationship.
Oh,
Right up to the day he went in the hospital. I mean, the very last poem he wrote to me, if I can say it without crying. So, Lynn, you and God are my rock right now, my love, and I cling to you both with all my might. I love you so very much. So that evening, he asked me how I would handle his death. And I said, look, I've been widowed once. I know the score. It's going to be fine. And he said, I want you to remarry. I said, James, why would I remarry? I have the most exquisite relationship now. That'll last me the rest of my life. And so he got really adamant. And I said, why do you want me to get married? He goes, Lynn, I wish you would marry a man that loved you as much as me and gives you everything I can't. And that's who I'm married to right now.
Yes.
Swear to God, my deceased husband and my friend Paul's deceased wife got together and they did this little trick on us. And now I can say that you don't just love once, you love over and over, and your energy goes into loving. And no matter how traumatized we might be, no matter how ill we might be, loving is the antidote to just about any question you have or situation you have.
That last 2 minutes of what you all just heard is such a gift to the planet. Order the book, have more moments like this. And I don't want to let go of that energy. I'm just going to say, Lynn, thank you so very much for being with us tonight. And to all of you out there, you just hang in this energy for a little bit and order the book.